readers. Welcome to Echoes of Lost Libraries. I shot this footage quite a while ago, and I wanted to just put in a quick intro and with some bonus books, and at the same time shout out Jorge over at Jorge's Corner for putting out the most amazing introduction to Argentine literature. I very warmly suggest that you check it out. And here's an exciting one. I picked up a hardback copy of The Lime Twig by John Hawkes. I have a paperback already, but this one has a bit of a story to it. This book came out in 1961, published by New Directions Publishing. And while doing press for this book, James Laughlin, the founder of New Directions, apparently were sending out copies to people who would like to hear the opinions of the book, sort of for press blurbs and such. And apparently this copy belonged to Nathalie Sarraute. And with her involvement with the Nouveau Roman, this is a good fit. The Lime Twig is beautifully written, dense, opaque, experimental, dark and disturbing. But yeah, I like the idea of this having passed from her library to mine. So that's exciting. And Sarraute I have not yet read, but it is time. I want to read more French Nouveau Roman books. For bonus book number 2, 4 years ago, I ordered a copy of J.R. by William Gaddis. Ordered a hardback. This is nice, but, it's not a hardback. So 2 years ago, I ordered a hardback copy of William Gaddis's J.R. And I received this. Not a hardback. Not even a nice paperback as my previous one. So that's unfortunate. So this year, I ordered a hardback of J.R. by William Gaddis. And boys, we got him. Finally, an actual hardback of J.R. So that is something. So I picked up Pages from a Cold Island by Frederick Exley, which is unfortunately the wrong place to begin, as that is book 2 in a trilogy of 3 autobiographical novels. Frederick Exley was struggling for a long time until he had his breakthrough with the critically lauded A Fan's Notes. But before that, he was institutionalized 3 times, where he had struggled with acute alcoholism and sort of an unhealthy obsession with the New York Giants, and he was a schizophrenic. So he writes a fictionalized biography, but there's no reason to not suspect that there's a lot of Exley in it, where he talks about drinking, womanizing, and literature. And I read about 50 or 60 pages in this, and it struck me that when he was talking about literature and teaching, it's quite interesting. Whereas the drinking and the womanizing is maybe not so interesting, but I did like his style and his writing more than, say, Bukowski or someone like that. So there might be something into reading this. And A Fan's Notes was nominated for a National Book Award, and it did receive the William Faulkner Award for Best First Novel, and also won a National Institute of Arts and Letters Rosenthal Award. So it was critically lauded, and I don't think maybe it sold the most, but it became a cult classic. And you see in this sequel, The Pages from a Cold Island, you see fans do little pilgrimages and seek him out to meet this larger-than-life figure that was described in the first book. But yeah, the second book, much less acclaim, but yeah, still it covers a different part of his life and a bit less interesting, seemingly. Here's a couple more books that I bought from Orpheus. Around the Day in 80 Worlds by Julio Cortazar, which seems very interesting. It's like a mix of like short stories and poetry and travel pieces and some book reviews, and as you can see, lots of interesting illustrations. He also, as the sweetheart he is, he threw in a copy of Pedro Paramo because we were talking about that I was not able to find a nice edition of it, and as I was buying some other books from him, he was nice enough to throw it in. It's a very, very good podcast on Pedro Paramo from Sherd's podcast. I very much recommend everyone check out. I picked up Man in the Holocene by Swiss writer and playwright Max Frisch. Frisch is a wonderful author, most well known for Homo Fabo and his diaries, his Tagebücher, which are autobiographical literary musings covering 1946 till about 1971. This is a much newer book, as it was written in 1979 and appeared in the English translation in 1980. It was well received, as the New York Times Book Review included The Man in the Holocene in its list of best books of 1980. The book seems very interesting to me as it's sort of erudite musings, and similar to David Markson's Wittgenstein's Mistress, the sort of unraveling of the protagonist's mind, or in this case his memory, is sort of a central point where he starts beginning to ask himself if we even need memory. Like, rocks don't need memory. In part autobiographical, he is the same age as his protagonist while he's writing this, and we can guess that the sort of ruminations on man's limitations and how our little bubble of time is so short in evolutionary sense. The book was translated by Geoffrey Skelton, who's an award-winning translator who translated a lot of Frisch's works, and he won the Schlegel Tieck Prize twice for his translations of Robert Lucas's biography of Frida Lawrence, and one for Siegfried Lenz's novel The Training Ground. I was initially supposed to read this with a group of friends, but my copy arrived so late that everyone read it and moved on, but I'm happy to look into it at a later point. Picked up some more Ricardo Piglia. Ricardo Piglia is probably my favorite find of the year. Really loved La Ciudad Ausente, or The Absent City, that I read earlier this year, and the first of his diaries. Piglia is most well known for bringing hard-boiled detective fiction to Argentina, and at first glance, his books start out as fairly ordinary detective stories, but once you get into it, you realize that this man is greatly influenced by Musil and Joyce and Roberto Arlt and Borges, even though he doesn't want to be. I have actually started reading Target in the Night, and it begins a very typical murder mystery, mysterious stranger arrives at town with money and ends up getting murdered. But it has lots of nice little details. It has a set of twins that no one can tell apart that has like this Borgesian quality where they're super competitive and compete only to try to discover the limits of their symmetry. And the investigator who's investigating the murder is this very philosophical, quiet, contemplative guy who takes the text in a more literary, philosophical direction. I'm enjoying it very much so far, but The Absent City also had a slow start before really taking off, so we'll see. I picked up The Art and Craft of Novel Writing by Oakley Hall. Not necessarily to learn anything about the art and craft of writing novels, but from what I read about it, it seemed like an interesting and insightful text on understanding novels and how they work. Oakley Hall is, of course, most well known for the book Warlock, which Sean over at Travel Through Stories did a wonderful review of. The chapters are, as you would imagine, talks about point of view and characters and plotting, and it's very well structured on how it shows off good and bad ways of doing things. It has a very, very cool part on style and prose that I really enjoyed. But take a look at these pages and how it's structured. You have like these texts from lots of great authors, and you have these margins where he's pointing out what works or what's problematic with the writing. And he's talking about the right level of detail that you should be on, and I appreciate that he uses negative examples as well to exemplify why something doesn't work. It seems very nice as well. Like his examples are varied. He admires Faulkner and Twain and Hemingway, Henry James, as well as others. I was very impressed. I wasn't expecting to have as much fun with this as I ended up having. I haven't read it from cover to cover yet, but like I said, I really enjoyed the part on style and prose, and I feel like this will be like a refreshing addition to the literary criticism that I have that are more traditional. I feel like this is more accessible in a way than a lot of the literary criticism that sort of assumes you have an English degree and understand the jargon and techniques for taking these things apart, while here we have very practical examples that I'm sure would help a budding writer, but it also is helpful to this old reader. So this will be nice. I picked up a copy of Human Wishes, Enemy Combatant by Edmund Caldwell. This is a 2022 reprint of the original 2012 book that was published on Say It With Stones Press. Sadly, Caldwell died in 2017 and didn't get to see the resurgence of his book. And I found some very high praise online, but I still don't see this book talked about a lot. While it seems very interesting from what I do gather. Caldwell already had an audience for his writing. He was a fairly popular literary blogger. He wrote 2 different blogs you could still read, one called The Chagall Position and the other Contra James Wood. The latter, which is quite interesting, where he will do things like dissect James Woods' reviews of other books. And while he very strongly disagrees with James Wood, the reading is still quite fascinating. He has some very interesting insights and takes on literature from Saramago to Krishnahorkai, and I would actually recommend reading the blog. This book, though, seems to take place in between places rather than in places. We get examples like airports, waiting rooms, temporary hotels. Never really at any destinations in this book. And one of the reasons why I mentioned his blog is because one of the subplots that turn up in this is a plot to kidnap and replace James Wood with a replica. Well, it's described as literary, full of dark humor, and has an obsession with Beckett, so I think this will be good, interesting. I picked up what is the debut novel of Christina Tudor-Sudari named Disembodied. I praised very highly. It was in my list of top 10 books last year, or under the Sign of the Labyrinth, which I still think is my favorite of hers. This is very interesting, though. It's a story from the perspective of someone who has died, and you get these great recollections from the life that was, and also you get to trace what is happening to the decomposing body of the protagonist. It has some beautiful descriptions of how some movement of sediment and water would move bones and parts of the protagonist in ways that seem to animate them with life, even though it was all illusory. Christina writes beautifully, poetically, and is always very rich philosophically. I think that I would recommend people begin with Under the Sign of the Labyrinth, but ideally just get both, because she's a fantastic writer, and she makes me want to reread Blanchot, which has been a while. But yeah, love Sudari. I picked up Forbidden Territory, one of the volumes of Juan Goytisolo's autobiography. I haven't read Masks of Identity, but I read Count Julian, and I found it to be an interesting read. He is clearly very alienated from his Spain, and he seems to be angrily tearing apart Spanish culture, and he also has like a very raw and unromantic, frank depiction of homosexuality that I'm sure was shocking when written. He's also very knowledgeable of the Islamic tradition, which he admired. And I want to read the rest of the trilogy, but I figure that it would be interesting to know a little bit about the man as well. So I saw a deal on this, so I figured it would be neat. And of course, I see a lot of people are getting copies of Luis Goytisolo's large book, Antagony, that has happily gotten a reprint now, which I'm also looking forward to getting. He is getting more attention these days, but I think that Juan Goytisolo also deserves to be discussed. I picked up The Helmet of Horror by Victor Pelevin. I know Pelevin is a bit divisive in my circles. Some people find him shallow and boring, and others find him to be quite interesting. I kind of passed on him the first time people I knew read him, but this book is dealing with the Theseus myth, and I have a soft spot for any literature that uses these source materials and takes it to interesting places. And this is a part of the Canongate Myth series, which is a series of novellas published by Canongate Books, where myths from various cultures are reimagined and rewritten. There are some interesting sounding ones that I would also like to try. There is the Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. Olga Tokarczuk wrote one about Ainana, which is sadly not translated yet, but that would be very cool to get. And Dubravko Gresic wrote Baba Yaga Laid an Egg, which is also something to get to. So I picked up an Ingmar Bergman biography. I went to a flea market, and this was the only book that sort of caught my interest. But Bergman has been one of the few movie makers that I've enjoyed recently, and yeah, so this should be an interesting read. I also picked up Life Sentences by William H. Gass. I know that Gass is divisive as well. I think that some people find his style overwrought, and I think some people conflate a lot of what he's writing about and who he is as a person, or who he was as a person. But this essay collection, he ponders on some of the work of writers like Kafka, Nietzsche, Henry James, and Gertrude Stein, Proust, etc. And I really love Gass and his project, his sense of aesthetics and just sort of monomaniacal focus on the sentence and style. He includes an interesting quote from John Gardner. I have nothing to say except that I think words are beautiful. I'm a stylist. For me, everything is rhythm and rhyme. There are a handful of other stylists, like Gass, Elkin, Bartholomew, Barth, and Ralph Ellison, who have nothing to say either. We just write. And yeah, and thus my love and admiration for Gass will continue. And speaking of Elkin, Elkin is someone who's been on my radar for a very long time, and I've very much wanted to read him. From what I understand, he is like a rare genius of language. Gass mentions that he's not very much an idea man, but that his gifts as a writer were powerful indeed. And this is another essay collection, and a horrible place to start with Elkin. I just saw a hardback at a good price, and I figured it's a low opportunity cost, and let's get a little sense of what Elkin thinks like, and what his focus and sort of sense of aesthetic is about, and hopefully one day I'll get his major works available so that I can sample and see if the word of mouth is right about him. But seeing as the lavish praise that Gass and Cynthia Ossick and Robert Coover, John Gardner, so many people praise this man greatly. So yeah, excited to get around to Elkin finally. This summer I was reading and rereading P.G. Wodehouse, a bunch of different Jeeves and Wooster books, and I picked up Yours Plum, the letters of P.G. Wodehouse. I've just recently starting on reading Summer Storm, one of the Hastings Castle books, which I'm very excited to finally reading some non-Jeeves Wodehouse. But I love Wodehouse. I think he is so consistently funny, and he's funny in a way where language is pivotal, and it just feels like such a treat to read this funny and surprising prose at times, and I'm very impressed with how even and high quality Woodhouse's writing is. And it's nice to see some of these letters. Wodehouse married, but he never had any kids, but he adopted Leonora, or he keeps referring to as Snorky, or his angel snorkels in these letters. And it's nice to see this sort of charming British gentlemanly life. But it wasn't all easy for him. He had moved to France for tax reasons, and he was captured by invading German forces in 1940, and he stayed interned for nearly a year. Well, he was very prolific. He wrote a ton of plays. He wrote like 90 books, I think. I'm finally dipping my toes into non-Jeeves stories, enjoying some Blanding's Castle at the moment, and yeah, it's wonderful. I'll always love Wodehouse, and it's nice to get a little more access to the man behind all these wonderful books. Earlier this year, I read The Marriage of Cadmus and Harmony by Roberto Calasso, and I really enjoyed that book, so I decided to pick up The Ruins of Kosh, also by Roberto Calasso. And Roberto Calasso is an interesting figure. He worked for Adelphi in Milan, a publishing house that has published many of my favorites, including Tommaso Landolfi and Giorgio Manganelli. And there he worked with Roberto Baslin, another very interesting figure, the Italian translator who founded Adelphi. He was also a writer, but he never published anything while he was alive. But Dalkey Archive published a very interesting Notes Without a Text in 2019 that Calasso wrote the foreword to. Calasso was also married to Fleur Jaguy, who of course is an excellent novelist and a translator, correspondent with Ingeborg Bachmann. Very interesting crowd Calasso mingled with. The subject of the book is the periods before and after the French Revolution. This is the first book in what's going to be a series of books focusing on mythology and modernity, and sort of the connection between how we told stories and how the modern mind is made up. He writes very interestingly about Greek mythology, Hindu mythology. He has a book on Kafka. He has a book on Baudelaire. He's very erudite and well worth the time. Now, sadly, I picked up Lima's Paradiso, and as you can tell, it's in the original Spanish. That's not what I intended. My Spanish is nowhere near good enough to read it as it is, but I'm learning, so maybe this can be something I try at some point. It sounds like a very fascinating book, though, so maybe I'll get an English copy as well. Here's one I've been looking forward to. Los Siete Locos, The Seven Madmen by Roberto Arlt. I have been very excited about this ever since I've been reading Ricardo Piglia, and both in forewords and in his diaries, he speaks very highly of Roberto Arlt. He, as I mentioned in my Macedonio Fernandez video, he sort of thinks that Argentine literature moving forward should model themselves on Arlt and not on Borges, which I suppose it did, as many people claim him as an influence, including and with writers like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Cesar Aira, and Piglia himself citing that influence. I suppose that is so. I kind of want to acquire and read his first book, his debut, The Mad Toy. But Seven Madmen and a sequel called The Flamethrowers is considered to be his magnum opus. and it has been republished in January of this year by Riverboat Books under the title of Madmen in Revolt. So it's a great time for new readers to pick up Roberto Arlt. I picked up Women's Voices from Latin America. It's by Evelyn Picot Garfield, and it was released in 1987 by Wayne State University Press. It's a collection of interviews with Harmonia Summers, Griselda Gambaro, Julieta Campos, Elvira Orfe, Luisa Valenzuela, and Marta Traba. And it's quite interesting, but I think it's more interesting if you have read or are planning to read these writers. I've read Julieta Campos and Marta Traba so far, and the interviews are interesting. They talk a lot about who writes worthwhile prose of other women writers. And Luisa Valenzuela is next on my list. I picked up the Black novel with Argentines and The Lizard's Tale. Now, Valenzuela is probably the most experimental of the lot. One of the least experimental is Marta Traba. I read her Mothers and Shadows earlier this summer, and it is still a very good book. It really stuck with me, particularly some of the descriptions of how normalized the violence and the threat of authority and torture was. This is a bit of a strong scene I'm going to describe, so viewer discretion. But there is one woman who is clearly suffering from some sort of PTSD who says, "Thank God I wasn't tortured. What they did to me was nothing compared to those who are tortured." And she was kicked in the stomach till she blacked out and had a miscarriage. So it's definitely strong stuff, but very interesting view into the terror people lived with during the Dirty Wars. I picked up The Naked Woman by Harmonia Summers, which was published in 1950, and it was sort of recognized for its shocking erotic content. It was translated by Kit Maud, who has an active and interesting Twitter presence, and he has had some interesting podcast appearances as well. The interview with Harmonia Summers, she talks about how she had a dream that sort of made this book write itself. As for the content of the book, I'll just refer you over to Sherd's podcast for an amazing episode on that book. I picked up Christina Rossi's The Ship of Fools, and the way life goes sometimes. I've already made a full video on this book, so if you're interested, check out that video. I think I thought it was very fun and a good read. And Christina Rossi, she pops up in a lot of these other books I've read on women experimental writers and the postmodernism over in Latin America. I picked up The Uses of Literature by Italo Calvino. Now, Calvino will always be a favorite of mine, and I have not read much of his nonfiction. I have read Why Read the Classics, which is in this collection, but it has a lot of other interesting sounding articles. The Odysseys within the Odyssey is one I'm really excited about. There's some speculations about linguistics, artificial intelligence, and the mechanization of the production of literature. Hopefully I will get some some insights on what to look for in my reading, and that the master Italo Calvino will steer me towards new and interesting reads in my future. But yeah, very excited to get this nice collection of essays by Italo Calvino. Picked up The History of Luminous Motion by Scott Bradfield. This is a very interesting sounding book. Many reviewers describe it as having frustrating yet beautiful prose. The subject matter of the book is a boy named Philip. He's 8 years old. He is amazingly precocious and intelligent. He has some sort of hostility to the outside world and sort of tries to live through an abstract breakdown of the world in his mind. He's also a sociopath, and he commits murder. He has a friend. He does break-ins and does drugs and holds seances with. The blurb then fascinatingly says that his dad comes to stay, and Philip descends to a subterranean otherworld where he makes contact with dead black things, obloid and featureless, like faintly disembodied laundry hampers. So this is a debut novel, published by Bloomsbury in 1989. And interestingly, without really realizing, I knew about this writer from his YouTube channel. His YouTube channel is really good. He has great taste and reads interesting books, so should check it out. I also picked up Let the Earth Tremble at Its Centers by Gonzalo Celorio. This was a book where I was looking at another book that I had been wanting to get for a long time, and I clicked on the hyperlink to the translator of that book, and I noticed that this had also been translated by the same person, and reading into it, it seemed even more interesting. This is a city book. Here is a map of all of the happenings in the book, and it's about a professor who has an appointment to lead a group of students on a walking lecture through Mexico City. And the students never show up, and then he goes on a drunken ramble through the city, and he sort of muddles his personal history with the history of the city. And this was hailed as a great book when it came out, so I'm very interested to reading it, as not a lot of people I know have read it. I picked up Hermione by H.D. I have been vaguely aware of it for years, but it was really when I read Breaking the Sequence, women's experimental fiction by Ellen Friedman, that I got really interested in this, and Dorothy Richardson and other fascinating women talked about in that great book. The book itself has been described by some of my friends as amazingly dense. It's an interior self-portrait that stylistically really swings between modernist obscurity and moments of greater clarity. So it has this undulating quality, and it just sounds very wonderful. And the more people tell me about this book, the more excited I am to finally get around to having read some HD. Really, really want to get Helen in Egypt as well, but that will be for another haul. And last, but certainly not least, is All That Is Evident Is Suspect. Readings from the Oulipo from 1963 to 2018. Ian Monk edited this, and Daniel Becker, but Ian Monk also did a lot of the translations. The Oulipo is neat. The Of course, Raimon Quino and Italo Calvino, Perec. These are names that I imagine most of you are familiar with. Jacques Roubaud is one of my absolute favorites of his. Of my favorite of the Oulipo. Jacques Jouet. Harry Matthews is fun to read. And what this does is that it gives little examples of every single one of the members, up until 2018. I don't know if there's been any new members since, but very, very interesting. Hervé Le Tellier. He has an interesting book that'll probably show up on a future video, where it sort of sounds like a J.J. Abrams TV show, sort of exploring that sort of sci-fi sounding doppelganger concept. I want to just show you very quickly some of these. Every one starts with like when this was written and sort of like a little description of what it is before the thing itself starts, and here, it's a lot of the time they talk about what's very important to the Oulipo, because this started as sort of a secret workshop where the founding members were just sort of making these game-like restrictions on how to write. And famously Georges Perec writes a book without the letter E. That's like a very simple and silly sounding way to limit yourself, but you can't predict what that will do to your prose. And Sean at Travel Through Stories talked in his video that came out earlier today about Pogue Donahue, that this person looked at writing as this sort of irrational activity that you don't know what is happening. The words and characters just seem to take on a life of their own, and when you look at a restriction like avoiding a letter, that changes how you need to navigate language in such a huge degree that the prose that comes out will be a mixture of really crazy things. Limited vocabulary tests. One thing I want to talk about that's kind of interesting. Here we have like a description of the sort of games and techniques. But we have here Italo Calvino, How I Wrote One of My Books. And what this is, it's the sort of the algorithm of how he generated If on a Winter's Night a Traveler. And he explains here, like, what this means. This is like the reader, the book, and the person who's being read and is in the book, and we get sort of a breakdown of how he took this algorithm and how he created these relations, and becomes sort of like an extra layer to have in mind when reading the text. But it's very interesting, and I think that the book, like I mentioned earlier, is one of my favorites ever. It's like a beautiful book, and that really puts a lot of what the joys and what we as readers want. And the reader in the book, you can say that he wants romance, but since he finds this female reader and he wants to meet her, he wants to talk to her about books, and I think that's it. We want to connect with other readers who feel like we do, who are moved and share our enthusiasm, because face it, we live in a world where media is fast moving and digital, and the attention span and sort of the focus on reading is something that's ever diminishing, and that then also finding something that likes these challenging and literary works that we love is something to be treasured. It's why I'm trying to do why I'm doing what I'm trying to do. Some fun bilingual palindromes. Pretty funny, to be honest. But yeah, there's some. Here's like this is the Paris Metro line, I believe. Jacques Jouet was one who proposed in writing these subway poems. We have it's a beautiful, interesting book, and I don't know. I saw some reviews that were talking about how this was their first encounter with the Oulipo, and they found it very interesting. I don't know if that is quite the way to go, but if you have read Harry Matthews, Italo Calvino, George Perec, maybe a couple more, should read Quinault's Exercises in Style, then yeah, it's definitely very interesting. And well, if you made it this far, you didn't skip ahead, then I want to thank you very much. It is humbling and gratifying, and a real privilege to be able to talk about this and have an audience of smart, bright, passionate people who devote and give their attention to me. I hope you get something back for it. I definitely am getting a lot of joy, and I'm learning a lot by our interactions, so I'm just want to say I'm very thankful. Thank you. See you next time.